They were the outlaw kings of the road, until the enemies they tried to destroy refused to die. From highways soaked in rivalry to back-alley standoffs that shook entire biker nations, the Hells Angels have met many challenges. But only a few were dangerous enough to push them to the edge. This is the story of the clubs that rose up, fought back, and forced the Angels into some of the most explosive conflicts in biker history. Who challenged them, and who nearly broke them? Gypsy Jokers Motorcycle Club.
Phil Cross, Gypsy Jokers MC, and the Hells Angels in the early 1960s.
The conflict between the Hells Angels and the Gypsy Jokers is one of the most intense, unpredictable, and deeply personal biker rivalries ever recorded. Unlike other clubs whose wars revolved around territory, drugs, or expansion, this feud grew from pride, insults, territorial overlap, and long-standing grudges that kept boiling for decades. The Gypsy Jokers, formed in the 1950s on the West Coast, were never the largest outlaw club, but they were fearless. Known for their chaotic structure and willingness to go to extremes, the Jokers refused to bow to any biker organization, especially not the Hells Angels, who were steadily becoming the most powerful club in the world. Tensions first erupted in the 1970s when both clubs tried to dominate the Pacific Northwest. The Angels saw the region as the next step in their expansion, but the Gypsy Jokers considered Oregon and Washington their home turf. What began as bar fights and roadside confrontations soon turned into a shadow war of ambushes, clubhouse attacks, and retaliatory strikes. By the 1990s, the feud escalated to the point where police were forced to act like military peacekeepers. During major biker events, law enforcement set up sniper units on rooftops, not to instigate violence, but to prevent it. That's how serious the conflict had become. Two clubs so locked in hostility that authorities prepared for combat-level encounters. One of the most infamous flashpoints came when a senior Jokers member clashed publicly with Hells Angels leaders in Oregon, triggering months of tit-for-tat confrontations. Clubhouses were fortified, vehicles were reinforced, and members traveled in groups because riding alone meant taking your life into your own hands. In several instances, fights broke out at rallies, bars, and even small-town festivals, forcing police to shut down entire streets as the bikers squared off. Each side accused the other of disrespect, territorial intrusion, and sabotage. Even former members described the rivalry as a war with no beginning and no end, just constant smoke. What made this feud especially dangerous was the Gypsy Jokers' unpredictable style. While the Hells Angels operated like a structured, disciplined organization, the Jokers thrived on surprise, chaos, and making sure their enemies never knew what was coming next. By the early 2000s, after decades of conflict, the rivalry slowed. Not because either club backed down, but because law enforcement crackdowns became so intense that open warfare became too costly. Yet the tension never disappeared. Former investigators have said that among all the Hells Angels' enemies, the Gypsy Jokers remain one of the few clubs capable of igniting a full-scale war at any moment. But if you think rooftop snipers were extreme, the next enemy would drag the Hells Angels into a conflict so vicious and personal, the fallout would echo across the entire West Coast. The Iron Horsemen Motorcycle Club. The conflict between the Hells Angels and the Iron Horsemen MC is one of the most overlooked yet brutally intense biker rivalries in American outlaw history. Unlike many clubs that challenged the Angels and fell quickly, the Horsemen were stubborn, heavily armed, and fiercely territorial, especially in the Midwest, where they'd ruled long before the Angels ever set their sights on expansion. Founded in the 1960s in Cincinnati, the Iron Horsemen built their identity on three things: military-style discipline, tight internal loyalty, and total control of their territory. They weren't the biggest club, but they were among the most organized. The Angels knew expanding eastward meant eventually colliding with them, and when that day came, the Horsemen didn't budge an inch. The first sparks flew in the late 1980s when the Hells Angels began creeping toward the Midwest. Smaller clubs quickly patched over, but the Horsemen refused. They controlled key meth corridors, gun-running routes, and dozens of bars and safe houses across Ohio and Kentucky. Letting the Angels in would mean surrendering everything they had spent decades building. So they prepared for war, and war is exactly what they got. Tensions exploded in the early 1990s when a Horseman hangout was firebombed after a bar fight with several Hells Angels associates. That night, the Horsemen launched a counterattack, an ambush outside a roadside tavern where several Angels were drinking. Bats, pipes, knives, chains. Chaos unfolded in minutes. 2 Angels were hospitalized, and the rivalry was officially ignited. What made this rivalry deadly wasn't just the violence, it was the level of weaponry. The Iron Horsemen weren't just bikers, many were ex-military and experienced marksmen. Police raids uncovered automatic weapons, grenades, and military-grade equipment. Officers described their clubhouses as miniature fortresses. As the Angels pushed harder into Ohio, the Horsemen stepped up their retaliation. Shootouts erupted on highways. Clubhouses were riddled with gunfire. Safe houses were torched in the middle of the night. Members on both sides lived like soldiers, rotating sleeping spots, traveling in armed packs, and watching the roads for enemy bikes. The most infamous clash came in the late 1990s during a standoff outside a Cincinnati bar. A convoy of Hells Angels rolled into town, expecting to intimidate the Horsemen. Instead, dozens of horsemen surrounded them, armed, ready, and unblinking. Police had to intervene before shots were fired, but the message was clear: the Midwest belonged to the Iron Horsemen. The Angels backed off, temporarily, but the feud resurfaced again in the 2000s when law enforcement targeted both clubs for drug trafficking and weapons smuggling. Raids knocked out key members on both sides, but the animosity remained alive under the surface. To this day, the Iron Horsemen are one of the few clubs the Hells Angels never fully crushed, never absorbed, and never silenced. They may not dominate the news like other clubs, but deep in the Midwest, they remain a force Angels members approach with caution. Territorial, battle-tested, and unafraid, the Iron Horsemen proved that you don't have to be the biggest club to become one of the Hells Angels' most dangerous enemies. The Mongols MC.
In my area, it was more of a neighborhood group. I mean, we're all from the same neighborhood, the guys that were in the club.
In East Los Angeles, during the late 1960s, the streets were loud with lowriders, Chicano pride, Vietnam veterans coming home, and a shifting identity that didn't quite fit the mainstream biker world. At that time, the outlaw motorcycle scene in Southern California was dominated by older, primarily white clubs, and none carried a heavier presence than the Hells Angels. Their image controlled the West Coast biker landscape, and anyone outside their circles often felt pushed out of the culture they loved. Latino riders felt that tension the most. Many had just returned from Vietnam with combat training, discipline, and a sense of brotherhood forged in fire. But when they tried to join established clubs, doors stayed closed. In some cases, it wasn't just exclusion, it was direct dismissal. These riders were told, verbally and indirectly, that they didn't belong. So in 1969, a group of those veterans and local riders decided they wouldn't wait for acceptance. They would build something of their own, a club with its own identity, rooted in pride, strength, and independence. That club became the Mongols Motorcycle Club. Their founding wasn't about war, it was about culture and belonging. They wanted a patch that represented them, their neighborhoods, their heritage, their style. Their early rides were about unity and standing together in a world that didn't give them space. But as soon as the Mongols started growing, conflict became unavoidable. The Hells Angels had long considered Southern California part of their sphere, even if not officially locked down. They were the most recognized outlaw club in the world, and they saw themselves as the elite of the biker scene. So when a new club, especially one they didn't control, started rising in the same territory, alarms went off immediately. At first, the tension showed up in small, almost invisible ways. Encounters at local bars turned quiet and stiff. Gas station stops filled with long stares and unspoken challenges. At rallies and swap meets, members from both clubs walked with tense shoulders, waiting for anyone to make the first disrespectful move. These moments didn't make headlines, but they built the foundation of a rivalry that would one day become one of the most violent and long-running in outlaw biker history. The Mongols didn't back down. Their numbers grew as more Latino riders found a home in the black and white patch. Their chapters spread throughout Los Angeles, then further across California. Each new chapter was a statement. They weren't a temporary group. They were establishing a presence. The Hells Angels noticed. Their members saw the Mongols as a club that had emerged in what they considered their backyard. To the Angels, it wasn't just a new club, it was a challenge to their dominance. Meanwhile, the Mongols saw things differently. They felt they were simply building something they were denied, a home in the motorcycle world. They didn't intend to kneel, and they weren't going to shrink to make space for anyone else. That difference in perspective, one side seeing territory, the other seeing identity, became the fuel for the conflict. By the mid-1970s and early 1980s, the friction was no longer quiet. Confrontations grew more direct. What started as stare-downs evolved into bar fights, clashes at biker events, and violent encounters on highways. Law enforcement began recognizing the rivalry as a major threat to public safety. The Mongols, once dismissed as a small outsider club, became known as the most formidable enemy the Hells Angels had ever faced, not just in California, but eventually across the United States. The seeds planted in the late 60s had grown into a war that neither club could walk away from. The Devil's Disciples. While the Mongols and Outlaws usually dominate any discussion about the Hells Angels' most dangerous enemies, there was another club that sometimes disrupted the landscape, one that didn't wage a nationwide war, didn't try to take over the outlaw world, and didn't care about being the biggest threat. What they did care about, however, was their independence, their territory, and keeping control of the streets they considered theirs. This was the Devil's Disciples Motorcycle Club, a Michigan-based outlaw club formed in the mid-1960s. Unlike the Angels, who became a global brand, or the Mongols, who grew into a major West Coast force, the Devil's Disciples were more regional. Their strength came from local loyalty, long-standing connections across Michigan, and a reputation for reacting hard anytime someone challenged them. They were not a club that looked for national dominance or wide-scale expansion. They didn't push for coast-to-coast influence. Instead, they built a tight network throughout Michigan and surrounding areas, with members who grew up together, worked the same blue-collar jobs, and rode the same highways year after year. Their identity was built on loyalty to their home turf, and an attitude that nobody, not even the Hells Angels, would walk into their neighborhoods without consequences. This is what made them unpredictable. The Devil's Disciples weren't consistently at war with the Angels the way the Mongols or Outlaws were. But when their paths crossed, it almost always erupted into something loud, physical, and difficult for local law enforcement to control. Their clashes were the kind that didn't last long, didn't spread across multiple states, and didn't turn into long-running feuds. But the intensity made them unforgettable. Most of these confrontations were rooted in territory or pride. For example, when biker events in the Midwest drew multiple clubs to the same location, the Devil's Disciples often made it clear that they weren't interested in sharing space with the Angels unless boundaries were respected. And if boundaries weren't respected, the entire environment changed instantly. What was supposed to be a festival with live music and open bars could turn into a scene where club members faced off in parking lots, clubhouses locked their doors, and organizers scrambled to shut everything down before things escalated. Inside bars, small arguments could turn into explosive confrontations. A disrespectful comment, a stare held for too long, or someone wearing colors in the wrong place was enough to send bottles flying and tables crashing over. Bartenders and owners in certain Michigan towns knew that if the Devil's Disciples and the Angels walked in within minutes of each other, everyone else needed to either leave or stay out of the way. Freeway encounters were even more chaotic. Both clubs took pride in their riding skills, and when members crossed paths on the road, tensions sometimes turned into high-speed face-offs. It wasn't uncommon for riders to throttle up, test each other's nerve, and push their bikes to extremes just to prove a point. These weren't planned clashes, they were spur-of-the-moment bursts of adrenaline, fueled by pride and the unwritten rule that no club would back down first. The Devil's Disciples never set out to become the Angels' greatest enemy. They weren't interested in overthrowing anyone or expanding into traditional Hells Angels territory across the country. But their willingness to defend their identity and their refusal to let any larger club dictate how they operated added a layer of volatility to the biker world. They were the spark that could ignite a larger fire. They were the wild card. Whenever the Angels showed up in Michigan or nearby states, the air grew thick. Clubs like the Mongols and Outlaws might have been the Angels' biggest rivals, but the Devil's Disciples were the kind of enemy who didn't need long-standing history or national battles to make their presence felt. All it took was one encounter in a bar, one stare down on a highway, or one misunderstanding at a rally. And suddenly, the Angels were facing a club that fought with intensity, unpredictability, and absolutely no fear. The Devil's Disciples weren't the main enemy, but they were the kind of enemy who made every conflict more dangerous. While the Mongols were battling the Hells Angels in the west, a different kind of rival was rising in the Midwest and East, older, larger, and historically entrenched in America's outlaw biker culture. This was the Outlaws Motorcycle Club, often identified by the iconic skull and pistons logo and the letters AOA, American Outlaws Association. Founded in 1935 in McCook, Illinois, the Outlaws were one of the oldest outlaw motorcycle clubs in the United States, predating even the Hells Angels. Their roots were tied to blue-collar workers, truckers, factory laborers, and men shaped by the industrial backbone of the Midwest. Unlike many younger clubs, the Outlaws didn't rise from rebellion alone. They evolved over decades, building a strong structure and a long-standing tradition of loyalty among their chapters. By the 1950s and 1960s, they began expanding beyond Illinois into Wisconsin, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio. They formed alliances in the Great Lakes region and built a network of chapters that operated with tight coordination. The Midwest was becoming their stronghold, and they guarded it fiercely. The Hells Angels, meanwhile, were rising fast on the West Coast. As their influence spread eastward throughout the 1960s and 1970s, they began establishing chapters in areas the Outlaws considered essential to their identity. To the Outlaws, this wasn't just expansion, it was an invasion. The Angels saw it differently. To them, they were simply growing, reaching new cities and planting their flag across the country. But the Outlaws had been there long before, and they weren't about to watch another major club take root in their backyard. This territorial overlap set the stage for one of the biggest rivalries in biker history. The first major conflicts were over geography. States like Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, and Ohio became friction zones where both clubs were active, each trying to maintain influence. The tension wasn't always visible, but it simmered constantly. At biker events, police noticed the way both clubs kept distance at opposite ends of the grounds. At bars, the atmosphere shifted instantly when Angels and Outlaws walked in at the same time. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, clashes between the two clubs became more direct. These weren't sprawling coast-to-coast wars. They were sudden confrontations that erupted without warning. A bar fight in Indiana, a parking lot showdown in Michigan, a motorcycle run in Chicago turning into a blockade. Each encounter added fuel to the rivalry. On highways between Chicago and Detroit, law enforcement grew so accustomed to the possibility of conflict that certain stretches of road became unofficially known as danger zones when both clubs were active. Patrol units learned to monitor large rides carefully, knowing that members from both sides sometimes encountered each other unexpectedly. And those moments didn't always stay peaceful. Internationally, the Outlaws had another advantage. They had expanded into Europe faster than most American clubs. Their presence in Germany, England, Belgium, and Scandinavia gave them a wide-reaching network, which elevated their status and influence. The Angels, who also expanded internationally, now found themselves facing a club that not only matched them in America, but also stood strong overseas. Back home, the Outlaws were known for a structured, almost military-like organization. Chapters communicated clearly. Orders traveled through the ranks. Their internal discipline often gave them a tactical edge, especially in the Midwest. The Hells Angels, on the other hand, were known for size, reputation, and the power of their global brand. When the two forces collided, the results were explosive. Veteran bikers who had seen countless conflicts said that nothing matched the energy when Angels and Outlaws stood across from each other. The standoffs were tense, silent, and heavy, like two armies waiting for someone to blink. Neither side backed down, neither side yielded territory willingly, neither side wanted to give the impression of weakness. The Outlaws weren't just another rival club. They were the only club with the history, numbers, and organizational backbone to truly challenge the Angels across multiple regions. Their presence turned the Midwest into a battleground of influence, pride, and power, a conflict that would continue shaping biker culture for decades.